Excerpt from the third part of Lesson 01 of the online philosophy course by Professor Olavo de Carvalho on March 14, 2009. This image of the ideal self is the only criterion you can have to achieve, someday, any type of objectivity in the judgment of yourself. I've always been surprised by the fact that, in Brazil, people generally don't have a life plan. For so many years, people have gotten used to such an unstable social life that they ended up focusing on the immediate because they can't have a long-term life perspective. But we must overcome this, and we cannot continue in the state of dispersion and chaos that the rest of society is in. The obituary narrative must be brief, no more than 20 or 30 lines, absolutely no more, and I will read all of them, no matter how many there are. I don't guarantee I will comment on each one, for an obvious material impossibility, but I will make some general comments afterward. We begin with this exercise so that you have, from the outset, an exact notion of the type of knowledge and the type of intellectual and human activity that philosophy is. Our entire course is directly inspired by the person of Socrates. This doesn't mean that we will have to read the complete works of Plato or know all of Socrates' pedagogical activity. It's not about that. We will take a kind of essential image and try to revive it in our own lives. We will try to imitate it, take it as an example in what it has of essential and significant for us today. In many of my lectures, I have defined philosophy as the search for the unity of knowledge in the unity of consciousness, and vice versa. Here in this course, we will have a practical view of this, how it is realized in practice that I consider that philosophy, when it became a university profession in the medieval university, opened the door to a tremendous progress in philosophical technique. But the profession has its internal demands. The profession is a sociological phenomenon in itself, and the structure of this sociological phenomenon is entirely independent of the constitution of philosophy as a discipline and way of life. There is no coincidence between the two. If you observe the various social formulas on which the practice of philosophy has relied throughout time, you will see that it is something quite varied. Philosophy begins as a sort of club of enthusiasts gathered around Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and the first universities were formed exactly like that. They actually looked more like this course than what we now call a university. People who are interested in knowledge gather together and call the professors who seem most suitable to guide them. As the institution grows, however, it faces certain social, economic, structural, bureaucratic, etc., demands that are determined by the state of society at each moment and not by the internal demands of the study of philosophy, so over time, this can become quite conflicted. During the period of German idealism, for example, the status of university professors in Germany was almost equivalent to that of a state minister. The professor was a person who spoke on behalf of the German state. I have the impression that, if it weren't for this, Hegel's philosophy wouldn't be what it is. Because Hegel is eminently the thinker who speaks on behalf of the German state and, in a way, personifies it historically. Naturally, there was an implicit commitment to valorize this state and, in a way, make it the expression and culmination of 2 millennia of philosophical activity, and that is exactly what Hegel does in his philosophy of the state. But if the German state had this essential philosophical importance, it should have emerged earlier in history. That is, what you have here is a confluence between 2 historically independent lines of development. On the one hand, you have the entire tradition of philosophical speculation, and on the other, the formation of a modern nation. One has absolutely nothing to do with the other, but these 2 lines cross at a certain point, and this influences the very content of Hegel's philosophy, constituting a kind of sociologically conditioned subjective bias. Similarly, identical confluences are seen in a number of modern philosophies, where the bureaucratic and sociological demands of the institution called the university end up influencing the very content of philosophy. Without most philosophers conducting a critical examination of this situation. The result is then quite strange because philosophies emerge and develop independently of a clear awareness of the sociological conditions that generated and determined them, and in philosophy, this is an unforgivable thing. Throughout all of Socrates' activity, the thing he does most is precisely examine the immediate social and political conditions in which he lives and in which those dialogues unfold. In every Socratic dialogue, he is aware of his social position and that of each of his interlocutors, and his meditation begins precisely from the observation of this social reality they are living in. If, after 2400 years, philosophies appear whose authors ignore the social conditions in the content of these very philosophies, the conditions that generated and determined their forms, then we haven't had progress, but regression. In the modern university institution, for example, there is a purely administrative distinction between the departments of sciences. Letters, psychology, public administration, etc., and the philosopher carries out a particular activity within this framework. This framework limits the content of what he can and cannot say, or at least limits the program of his course. So, what does he have to do? What would be the philosopher's number one obligation? Start by reflecting on this same sociological framework within which he is working and analyze it critically, and this is practically never done. These philosophers accept the bureaucratic professional delimitation of their activities and continue playing their roles as if they were in a play, where various characters are assigned to the various actors, who must then act as though they really are those characters. You never saw, for example, during a performance of Hamlet stopping the play to complain about the actors' salaries. The social circumstance in which the play unfolds is not part of the play, they are absolutely separate things. You don't see a conductor interrupting the concert to discuss the operational problems of the theater administration or the union life of the musicians, for example, precisely because the artistic and show business world refers to a fictional universe that is absolutely separate from the real social circumstances in which the show takes place. In this sense, the exercise of philosophy nowadays seems more like a theatrical performance than like the philosophy as it was inaugurated by Socrates. Of course, for the content of philosophy, this is very serious. We can never forget that the first philosophy that emerges with Socrates, not with the pre-Socratics, who although practicing some philosophical activities, still didn't have a clear understanding of philosophy as a distinctive activity, begins as political philosophy, that is, as meditation and critical analysis not only of society in general but of the very social situation of his interlocutors. There is a scene in the Symposium, for example, where Alcibiades arrives and makes an indecent proposal to Socrates to have a homosexual relationship with him. And Socrates replies, "That's not for philosophers, that's for you guys, who are high society." In this sentence, you already have a whole description of the concrete social situation of the philosopher in relation to his students, who were members of the ruling class in Athens. When will you see, nowadays, a philosopher reflecting on the concrete social situation of his students? Never. Just yesterday, I was watching the movie Elite Squad, and there's a scene in the film where there's a university class. The students are all members of the upper middle class, from the south zone of Rio de Janeiro, who have read Michel Foucault and are there analyzing the social situation of the favela in light of Foucault. There's only one student, the police officer Matthias, who remembers to point out to his classmates the real social situation they are in, that is, who they are socially.
E com relação ao lance de Búzios, eu acho que tem que reprimir mesmo. Tem que reprimir mesmo, cara. Lógico, gente, pô, peraí, gente, eu respeito. Vocês não têm a menor noção. Como que não, cara? Você tava com um beckzinho, não tava? Peraí, calma. Vocês não têm a menor noção de quanta criança entra pro tráfico e morre por causa de maconha e de pó, tá? Do apartamentinho de vocês, daqui da Zona Sul, não dá pra ver esse tipo de coisa, não, tá? Vocês estão muito mal informados, estão muito mal influenciados por jornalzinho e televisão.
The entire analysis of a social situation and all political philosophy must start from the awareness of your position. You are not a drawing you make from the stratosphere, you are not an external observer of society, you are a participant. And if you don't have an awareness of what your role is in the show, you also don't understand the situation of others. In the case of the film, the discussion about the social situation of the favela was all being made from a completely hypothetical and unreal point of view. They were talking as if everyone were Michel Foucault and not as if they were the people they really are. Who were those students? The consumers of the drug distributed in the favela, the suppliers of the money for the drug trade to continue functioning. That was the real situation, but only that character, Matthias, was aware of it. This is a common situation in our university, which precisely expresses anti-philosophy in its most radical, most stupid, and most overwhelming form. We cannot accept this in any way. In this sense, the university institution has contributed more to suffocate the true vocation of philosophy. What can happen is that, within the institution, a man of genius, not just an exceptionally intelligent person, but a person with an extremely strong personality, sometimes manages to bend the situation to his favor. This is what happened here in the US with Eric Voegelin, who created a very specific and peculiar situation within the university and used the university's resources to do something that didn't fit at all within the university itself. It didn't fit so much that when he went to Munich, Germany, and gave his first conference on political science, a funny episode happened. There was a very famous German sociologist, but whose name I can't recall now, and when Voegelin finished his lecture, the guy was absolutely perplexed. He said, "What kind of political philosophy is this?" He didn't talk about legitimacy, didn't talk about democracy, didn't talk about human rights. I don't know what he's talking about, it's another subject. That is, this sociologist was reasoning political philosophy from the thematic present in the curriculum, while Voegelin was doing exactly the opposite. He was analyzing the entire political situation from the real experience of human beings as seekers of knowledge about society itself. To a certain extent, in the philosopher who reasons about the political constitution of society and seeks to understand its internal order. It is society itself that becomes aware of itself, and this obviously cannot be done from already stratified concepts like legitimacy, democracy, human rights, etc. Each of these concepts, to become something useful, must be brought back to the real experience, from which they originated in their historical origin and from which they resurface now. Of course, the philosophy, as practiced by Voegelin, was perfectly within the Socratic tradition of making sure that, in a certain way, all knowledge is self-knowledge, and all self-knowledge is, at the same time, scientific knowledge of the highest degree. This is something that, within the university institution, is extremely difficult to do, because you already have a whole stratification of social roles that determines in advance the theme, the approach, etc., through what could be called disciplinary demands. Similarly, when Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy came to the US, no one knew what to do with him or which department to place him in. Should we place him in the philosophy department? But he only talks about law, property schemes, etc. So let's place him in the law school. No, because he only talks about psychology. Let's put him in psychology, then. That doesn't work either, because he only talks about theology. They didn't know what to do, simply because Rosenstock was really trying to understand society from his own position in society and from the position of his students.